Why don't you take your Bible and go to the book of Esther? Go to the book of Esther this morning as we continue to work our way through. Esther is part of that series of last historical books. We were in Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then after that will be Job and then Psalms if you're looking in your Old Testament. Next week we'll look at Daniel. Skip ahead a little bit and look at Daniel. Interestingly enough, and we'll mention this again next week, in the Hebrew Scriptures, Daniel's not considered a prophet. He's considered part of the writings. But we're going to look at Daniel next week and look at it on a grand scale with regards to history. So here this morning, we're going to be looking as we talk about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Rick mentioned that tomorrow starts Vacation Bible School, obviously, and so a number of weeks ago, the leaders of VBS came to me and said, "Hey, would you be willing to wear a cowboy hat?" Right. And like Rick, it was like, I thought about it. Didn't take long. However, I did agree to this. Okay? Circa 1959, 1960. Okay? And obviously I don't look like that now. What that means is, listen, between then and now, I have a story. I have a story between then and now. Okay? And it didn't begin then. Okay? But I have a story. I have a story to tell. And by the way, and so do you. You have a story. Every one of us in our life has a story. And sometimes we get to thinking that our stories don't matter. I sat down a couple of summers ago and started to write for my family something about my story. And I said for a title for them was An Ordinary Life in the Providence of God. An ordinary life in the providence of God. You know, there's nobody ever going to write a biography about me unless I do it. I'm not that significant. We all think that only the stories of the significant matter. You know, this is, yesterday marked the 71st anniversary of D-Day, the D-Day invasion. And one of the films that marks D-Day, or helps us remember, one of the most popular films. Actually, some say it's the most realistic film portrayal of the D-Day invasion, was Saving Private Ryan. Saving Private Ryan is a story. And it's a story about a family and about an individual. Now, it's not a true story. There was no Private Ryan that we know of. It is a story, though, based in history. In 1944, Congress did pass a law that the last surviving son of a family would not be serving active duty somewhere else, but would finish out their service here home site in order to preserve the family. That came in response to a number of families who lost their entire, all their sons, the Sullivans, the fighting Sullivans. All 5 boys died in a naval, they all served in the same ship that was sunk. The Borgstroms, there were another. Saving Private Ryan, many think was the story of the Nyland brothers. The Nylands, there were 4 of them. 2 of them we know had died, and then the 3rd was presumed dead. And so the 4th was recalled from the European theater back to duty stateside. They later discovered that the 3rd brother, actually, who was missing in action, was alive. He had been captured and was serving in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Burma. But 1944, they changed the law, and Saving Private Ryan was based on that. It's a story. A life story. There are many stories that we might look at like that and say, wow, Or maybe, Unbroken, the story of Louis Zamperini. What a story. You can name a number of other people who you look at and say, wow, what a story. And we tend to think those are the stories that are significant and stories that matter. But no, all of our stories, your story and my story, matters. It's significant. It has a part in what God is doing in the world and in history. The story of Esther is a story of God's providence. It's a story of a life in God's providence. Now, Esther, one of the things that is unique about Esther in the scriptures is this. Anybody know? Hazard a guess? The name God, Lord, whatever, does not appear in the book of Esther. It's the one book in the Bible that the name of God does not appear at all. And some might think then, well, what's it doing in the Bible? Okay? But I want to tell you, God's fingerprints are all over it. Okay? It's a story of God's providence. Now, I've used that word providence a number of times already. I'm going to help us understand what providence is. Sometimes we read historical documents, particularly like for the United States, and you see the term providence. And we think that providence, many, particularly in modern times, want to think of it in impersonal ways. But that would be nonsensical. Providence is not impersonal. To say that, well, providence is merely a concept, and providence directed the leaders. Well, what do you mean providence? If providence is impersonal, what does providence look like? Who is providence? What is? It defines even the definition of what providence is. You see, providence is basically a compound word. Pro, before, video, to see, to foresee, to see before. Well, that takes a person to see before, and not merely as a spectator, but one who then acts accordingly, who sees and acts. So we get our word provide from that. See, what is to provide? It's to see and to act with regards to eventualities, to make preparation for that which is coming. So we can't say, well, providence is like fate. Fate doesn't direct anybody. Okay? Providence cannot be understood unless it's attached to a person. And so let me give you some definitions of providence. First is by J.I. Packer. These are certainly coming from a biblical or a theological point of view. J.I. Packer gives this definition. He says, the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby in overflowing bounty and goodwill, he upholds his creatures in ordered existence, guides and governs all events, circumstances, and free acts of angels and men, and he directs everything to its appointed good for his glory. That's a long definition. Jerry Bridges, who likes this definition, in his book, Trusting God, says, let me condense this down. And the fuller context of this quote is on the inside cover of the bulletin. But Jerry Bridges says God's providence is his constant care for and his absolute rule over all his creation for his own glory and the good of his people. Okay? And that certainly is a succinct, captures the idea, the essence of what providence means. There's another one Thomas Watson, a Puritan, who says this. He says there are three things in providence: God's foreknowing, God's determining, and God's directing all things to their periods and their events. Same kinds of idea that Jerry Bridges talks about, centuries later. Now, they're very good definitions, and I certainly like Jerry Bridges' definition. My favorite definition, though, is not trying to boil it down to its essence or it's just the simplest, Because sometimes when we boil it down to its simplest, sometimes we lose some perspective on the larger and the fullest sense of its meaning. And so let me give you what is my favorite definition by Carl Henry, a 20th century theologian. A lot longer, but you'll see why in a minute. The biblical view of providence is dramatically specific, and it unqualifiedly affirms particular divine providence. That is, that God works out his purposes not merely in life's generalities, but in the details and the minutiae of life as well. See, sometimes if I boil it down with Jerry Bridges and say, look, God does all things, directs all of creation for his glory and my good, that captures a much larger sense. Okay? This says, no, it's not just about the big. It's about the particulars. It's about the details of life. The Bible relates to divine providence not only general and universal structures, but also personal experiences. Nothing falls outside God's will and concern. Not just the mass of humanity, but each individual is significant to God. And so are life's particularities. Since all things fall within God's purview, even seemingly chance events should be considered divine providences. And he goes on and he says this, God's providence, moreover, embraces even the acts of those who rebel against his purposes, even while the holy will of the sovereign Creator, Lord of history, is being implemented for the present and final good of his people. It is on the basis of intelligible divine revelation, by faith grounded in the Word of God, that Christians affirm God's all-comprehending providence. That's what we see in the book of Esther. The book of Esther the story takes place between probably chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the book of Ezra. Okay, so sometime in that same time frame, the Persian Empire, let's kind of date that 465, 460, somewhere BC, is when this story takes place. The king on the throne is not Cyrus and it's not Artaxerxes. The Bible names him Ahasuerus, or his secular name is Xerxes. Xerxes is the king of Persia. Now, as the story unfolds, there's some things we need to know about Xerxes. Xerxes was a great king, kind of egotistical. You know, with greatness, many times you see a large ego. And that's true of Xerxes as well. And chapter 1 gives the illustration of his ego. Chapter 1 describes Xerxes having a party, a large party, long time to celebrate. Okay, it was a party that lasted for a long. Now, it didn't mean that it was continuous, but over a period of time, he invited people to come see how great he was. Okay, to celebrate the bounty, celebrate the good. And what he does after one particular occasion during this time is that they've had a good dinner, they've had a lot to drink, and he asks for his wife to be brought. Her name is Vashti. Now, we need to know that Vashti was a beautiful woman. To use a male vernacular, she was the hottest one you'd ever want to see. Okay? And Xerxes wanted her to come to the party. Understand, it wasn't to show her off for her glory. It was to show her off for his glory. See, he wanted everybody to know, hey, look who's on my arm. You know, we use the term arm candy. Okay? I've got arm candy. Her name is Barbara. Okay? Okay? Vashti was beautiful the most beautiful woman. And Xerxes wanted everybody to know how great he was that he had a wife like this. There are many who look at this and say, wow, okay, that certainly is abusive. And it was. Vashti says no. She's not coming. Understand, to do that means you're probably going to have a short life. To refuse the order, to refuse the edict, the demand of a king, certainly was a death sentence. Xerxes is rather upset about it. He calls his wise guys together and he says, hey, what should we do with this? And they said, well, number one, she's not allowed back in your presence. She's totally out of favor. She's not back in any place of favor anymore. And by the way, lest this word gets out and the other ladies in the kingdom start thinking that it's okay to diss their husbands, I'm going to tell you what, write a law. Write a law that says every woman, every wife has to do what her husband tells her to do. Now, I'll tell you, that's the law of the Medes and the Persians. Okay? Talk about chauvinism, okay, on display. No wife was to refuse her husband. And that sets the tale. That sets the story. Because what happens then is he looks for somebody to replace Vashti. So the order goes out, and it's not a beauty contest that people get to sign up for. Okay? They send their emissaries through the kingdom, and they take the most beautiful women. And they collect them all. And then they spend time preparing them. How to adorn themselves, how to present themselves, all the protocol. They take time. It takes months. Esther is one of them. Not by her choosing. She's collected up. So let me give you what the more common term is used. She becomes part of the harem. When they're all ready, they start coming before the king. Esther is Jewish, but she doesn't tell anybody. Verse 15 of chapter 2, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, she was raised by this relative. Her mom and dad had died. Mordecai was an older man, a much older man, who had a place of respect. I'll tell you why in a little bit. But it was her turn. She came to go into the king. She didn't request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. In other words, she followed the protocol. Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. They all looked at her and said, wow. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins. Now listen, don't read a romantic love story into this. That's not what happened. It wasn't that he looked and felt, oh, I fell in love with her. No. When he said he loved her, what he means is he liked her best of all. He thought she was the best. And so he sets her apart, makes her a queen. She's still part of a larger harem. But she now has the place of privilege, the place of honor. Esther still hadn't told him that she was Jewish. At the end of chapter 2, there's the record of a little particular event. Not much attention is given to it here, but it's important. Mordecai, who has this place of respect, the uncle, or great uncle, who sits at the gate, hears of a plot to assassinate Xerxes. And he tells Esther, he says, tell the king. And the plot is unraveled, it's foiled. The perpetrators are put to death. That's the last we see for now. Chapter 3, we're introduced to another character. His name is Haman. Now, Haman also is an egotistical, he's a bureaucrat who thinks he's more important than what he really is. But Haman doesn't particularly like Mordecai, because when he walks by Mordecai, he thinks Mordecai ought to give him the utmost honor, the utmost respect, and bow down to him, essentially. And when he walks by Mordecai, Mordecai ignores him. Mordecai doesn't give him the respect. And this infuriates him. And so what he determines to do is to get rid of Mordecai, but while he's at it, to get rid of all the Jewish people, all those like Mordecai. So he goes to the king and he says, listen, there's a group of people out here who really don't like you, and if given the chance, they'd do you in too. They'd rebel against you. They're going to be difficult for you. So here's an idea. And he bribes him and he says, look, I'll make sure that there's some return for you, but if you write the law, write an edict, write a law that says on this day of this month, and they project that date out, plan for it, said on that day, all the people out in the provinces, everywhere, can kill the Jews. In other words, you write the law for the Holocaust to wipe them all out, to exterminate them. Xerxes writes the law. Oh, and by the way, Mordecai, you're going to die on the gallows. I'm going to hang you. And that begins then the story of what's going on here. Okay? Because Mordecai, when he hears of it, goes to Esther and he says, Esther, you need to let the king know. You need to tell the king. So chapter 4, verse 8, he also gave him a copy of the text, the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther, inform her, to order her to go to the king, to implore his favor, to plead with him for her people. And her response is like, I can't do that. Unless the king calls for me, I can't just walk in and say I want to have an audience. It doesn't work that way. Verse 12, they relate these words back to Mordecai. Mordecai says, then tell Esther this. Don't imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And then here's the key. Who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? What he's saying is, listen, from all things, he says, you have been put into this position, into this place, at this time for a purpose. Now, he doesn't say it explicitly. But behind the scenes, he says, in God's providence, God has ordered all things for you to be in this place, in this time, to accomplish this purpose. And that really then sets the tone. I said, many describe the idea of providence as the invisible hand. The invisible hand of God, like the hand in the glove. And that's really the book of Esther. It's the invisible hand at work. And here it is. And Esther replies and says, I'll do it. I'll go to the king, not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So chapter 5 then is the story of what she does. She says, she goes and the king grants her favor, and the king says, hey, come on, come in. And then she hadn't seen him for 30 days. But he grants her favor and says, come in. And he says, what would you like? And she thinks about it, and some think she's got cold feet at this point, but yeah, it doesn't matter to me. She says, let's have a party. Let's have a feast and invite Haman. And so that's what they do. They have a feast, a banquet. They invite Haman. Haman looks around, and he's the only one there, the guest of honor. What do you want, Esther? Let's have another feast tomorrow. Let's have another feast. Haman goes home, and he says, wow, I am really smoking hot with the king. The place of favor, the place of honor, nobody else, man. I am really in line for something good. Now, after that dinner, chapter 6, the king goes to sleep that night, and he can't sleep. He's not sleeping. So he says, hey, bring the records. I want to read about my accomplishments and the things that I've done, the chronicles. And as he starts reading those, he comes across the story of a man who unraveled, made known the plot. His name's Mordecai. And he says to his servants, what do we do for this guy? Nothing. He says, really? Bring him. Give him a place of honor. Grant him. This guy is deserving of such honor and favor because he spared the life of the king. And so they start to honor Mordecai. Dinner comes, banquet comes, Haman comes back, and Esther says to the king, this man has plotted to kill Mordecai and all of my people, essentially. Now, Mordecai is like, whoa, this guy has got the favor of the king now. His queen's got the favor of the king, and here's Haman. He says, I got bad news for you, Haman. This is your last meal. And the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai now becomes the gallows on which Haman dies and his family. And that which belongs to Haman is granted to Esther and to Mordecai, and Mordecai is to a place of privilege and honor. The edict's still there. They rescind the edict. Along with that edict comes another one that goes out to the provinces and says that the Jews now have the right to execute those who had plotted against them to kill them on that day. And 75,000 people died. And they set up a day to remember this. It's called Purim, the Feast of Purim. Purim is just the plural form for pure, which means lot. Haman was the one who had cast the lot, and now Purim is the casting of lots, because the lot didn't fall to the Jews, the lot fell to Haman and his followers. And so the Feast of Purim was set aside as really 2 days to be honored and celebrated for God's preserving his people. Now, the Feast of Purim is not like a biblical feast that you see in the law, okay? That this is a feast that Mordecai orders and says, hey, as we go through time, we go through the ages, this is a day for the Jews to remember what God has done for his people. So it's like, hey, Memorial Day or 4th of July, it's a feast, a time to celebrate and remember what God has done, okay? And that's where Purim comes from. And that's the story of Esther. But where's the invisible hand? What are the things in providence? If God's providence is on display here, if the fingerprints are here, what do I learn about God's providence? If God is writing the story, and God's writing my story, and God is writing your story, we all have a story. What's providence? The minutiae, the details, the particularities. How do I understand them? The things I learned from Esther with regards to the providence of God are these. No particular order. Number one, the providence of God includes, at times, being victimized by the sinful acts of others. It includes being victimized by the sinful acts of others. You see, remember Esther was part of a harem. She was a victim. It wasn't something she signed up for. And although a harem had its perks, understand that we would understand that this is sexual abuse. This is the abuse of women. If I expand that out and say, listen, difficult and undesirable circumstances of my life are included in the providence of God. I wish, if I told you my story, I gave you my story and said on every page, man, it was just one good time, one good time, one good time, one good time, you'd say, well, this is great, but this is unrealistic. And you're right, because there's nobody who has a story like that. You see, all the stories, all of our stories have those times where it's hard, where it hurts, the difficulties, the struggles, the pain. There are chapters of our lives that contain that. And my tendency is to try to say, well, God doesn't include those things. Yes, he does. All things fall under the purview of God. And God is able to accomplish his providence even through the willful acts of sinful men. One of the greatest illustrations of that in the Old Testament is not just Esther, it's Joseph. We all love the story of Joseph. And you get to the end of Joseph's life, and he's looking at his brothers, and he says, look, because they're scared to death. They think daddy's dead, now it's their turn. He's going to get even, going to get revenge. And he looks at him, and he says, look, you designed this for evil. God designed it for good. Now, let me explain something to you. Because there are people who look at that and say, you designed it for evil, but God, man, thank God that he stepped in here and he made something really beautiful and good come out of this mess. That's not what it says. This is what it says. You designed this purposefully, intentionally for evil. God, same word, designed this purposefully, intentionally for good. It didn't absolve them of their responsibility or their accountability. The life of Joseph, the story of Joseph, included things that were very painful that God designed and God wrote into his life. Second, the Lord prepares us in time for his purpose. Mordecai says to Esther, God is for such a time as this. There are times in my life, and as you get older, you kind of get more nostalgic. Okay, yeah, I wish life was like that again, somewhat. And I often look, and I look at what's happening in the life of the church, and as I relate it to my ministry or whatever, it's like, man, I feel like a fish out of water in these times. Maybe I really was born, I should have been born earlier. Sometimes we feel like that. And you come to realize, no, you were born exactly when God designed you to be born. You're in the right time. Right now. Whatever age you are. You say, well, I wish I was older. I wish I was younger. No, you're at the right time, right now. And if you're in time, then you're tied to space. It means you're in the right place at the right time. God has ordered your life, designed. By the way, that means you're sitting here, remember, the minutia, the details, the particularities. So you're sitting here, you're not getting out of 12. I'll give you some foreknowledge, okay? Okay? Right now is not by chance, randomness, or merely the execution of your will. Understand that. The minutia, the details, the particularities of life are you're here right now in this place, in this time, because guess where God has you? That means with regards to your job, you are right now where God has you. This time, this place. Third, God's providence demonstrates the foolishness of sin. It demonstrates his wisdom and the foolishness of sin. What do I mean? I think it's illustrated in Haman. Haman's a wicked man. Haman plots. He devises in his heart a rebellion against God's promises, against God's will, against God's covenant people, against God's what God. He may not have known all of that, but he's rebelling against it. And the expression of that is he's going to hang Mordecai. And you can say it's the twist of fate. No, it's not the twist of fate. That Haman dies on those gallows. There's the foolishness of God on display. The foolishness of man and God's dealing with it on display for his glory. It reveals the wisdom of God. Listen, things like this. You reap what you sow. Okay? God's judgment on sin is a revelation of his glory. And he judges in time. And he judges in space, and he judges it as part of his providence. Listen, not only did Haman die, 75,000 other people died. God's judgment on sin in his providence reveals his glory. Okay? God's providence in our particulars is never just about our individual lives, but it impacts those in our immediate circle and broader in time and space. Providence wasn't just on display for Esther in Esther's life, her uncle's life, and broader even to the people of Israel. You know, there are times, and I'll speak to dads because I'm a dad and I think this way, I have thought this way, that sometimes I think it's all about me. Okay? What God does in my life. See? That the way God leads me is what matters. Sometimes it's forgetting that I have a wife and I have children. And guess what? They are just as significant, and God's working in the particulars and the details and the minutia of their lives as he is mine. Sometimes I forget that. If I were writing those chapters and you were to see it, I've become more and more mindful of that over the years, where God has done things in my life, and I thought, well, this is for what I'm going to do, for me, and it wasn't about me. It was about somebody in my family or somebody else. See, 17 years ago, it would be very easy to say, hey, God moved us from North Carolina to come here to Ohio because what? God is interested in you being the pastor of Faith Bible Church there in Cincinnati. And God has something for you to do, and for you to do, and for you to work in somebody. Really? As if my wife and my kids are just along for the ride. They're not along for the ride. God is just as concerned and providing and working in their lives and writing the story of their lives, just like he is mine. They needed to be here in Cincinnati just as much as I did. Sometimes we forget that. We think it's all about us and the lives that we touch. Broader. God's providence in our particulars, they're not isolated. The ramifications, the way it touches all those around us, that God places in our circle, because God is working the details of their life too. There's a theory of theology called the openness of God. This is one of the great reasons I think the openness of God is false, because it isolates life and choices in life to without having ramifications on anybody else. It's individualistic, my opinion. Listen, God is at work. You're sitting here this morning by God's design. And maybe you, right now, things seem to be going along good. You know, they're good and perfect gifts, and I've got good and perfect gifts from God right now. I don't know what tomorrow holds, and you don't either. Okay? But if tomorrow things go south in a hurry, understand the book of James says that's a good and perfect gift from God too. See, James 1. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And that passage is set in the context of difficulties in life. How do we respond? Because that's why I like what Carl Henry says. God's providence, moreover, embraces even the acts of those who rebel against his purposes, even while the holy will of the sovereign creator, Lord of history, is being implemented for the present. And the final good. It is for good. It is for our good. It may not be seen in the present, but there is a finality, there is a purpose, there's an end in view. It is on the basis of intelligible divine revelation, by faith grounded in the Word of God, that Christians affirm God's all-comprehending providence. How do I know? Well, I come back to what God says about himself and what God has said he will do, and my confidence is in a God who is good, and a God who is wise, and a God who is purposeful, and a God who sees more than this moment in time. See, that's why that hymn that we sang is one of my favorite hymns of all time. It is set to a new arrangement. God moves in mysterious ways his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. It's mysterious, yes. And bitter may be the bud, but sweet is the flower. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him. But trust him. Because behind that frowning providence, there's a smiling face. And God is his own interpreter. And he will make it plain. And I trust in that God. That's what providence is. That one has gone before me, has seen and worked out and knows the details, particulars of my life, directing my steps for my good, but all for his glory. You're here today because God wants you to know you can trust him. No matter what you're going through, today, whether it's good, or tomorrow, whether it's not, you trust him. Pray that we will, as a body of people, individuals, and those around us, trust him for his goodness and his glory.